Hey guys, welcome to KS Shorts. We're in a series on dealing with doubts, and over 7 videos we're exploring what doubts are and how we can practically manage them when they arise in us. In our first video we were looking at the dictionary definition of doubt, which says that doubt is a feeling of uncertainty that leads to a lack of conviction. And we were also exploring Hebrews chapter 11 verses 1 and 2, which says that faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. For this is what our ancestors were commended for. And we were talking about how those feelings of uncertainty are actually entirely normal and natural. Many of those ancestors who were commended for their faith went through times of feeling uncertain, but they didn't allow their emotions and their feeling of uncertainty to define them. They chose to turn up anyway. And in the same way for us, our biggest day of faith isn't the day when full of the Spirit and full of certainty we turn up to do what we believe God is calling us to. Our biggest day of faith is the day when feeling uncertain and feeling unsure, we still choose to step in. And today we're going to be looking at the second part of that dictionary definition, a feeling of uncertainty that leads to a lack of conviction. And what I want to say is that whilst feeling uncertain is entirely natural, we do have to be careful, because if we're not careful, we can allow the feelings and the situations we're in to overwhelm us, consume us, and to cause us to stop. We literally begin to sink. We're just going to look at a story that turns up in 3 of the Gospels, where Jesus and Peter walk on water together. Basically what happens is the disciples are in a boat in the middle of a storm. And while they're in the boat, they see a white figure walking towards them on the waves. And at first they're petrified, but then Jesus calls out, "Do not be afraid, it is I." Now Peter, who's in the boat with the disciples, calls back, "If it is really you, Lord, call me out on the water towards you." So Jesus does, and incredibly, Peter gets out of the boat and gets onto the water and begins walking towards Jesus. It's all going well until something changes and Peter begins to sink. He cries out, "Lord, save me!" And Jesus immediately reaches out his hand, lifts him onto the waves, and they walk hand in hand together back to the boat. "You of little faith," says Jesus, "why did you doubt?" And there are 3 things in this passage. I mean, there's a lot in this passage, but there are 3 specific things that I really felt drawn to today. The first is that Peter wasn't sure, but he chose to get out of the boat anyway. Just like our last video, the first thing that Peter says is, "If it is you, Jesus, if it is you, if." He's not 100% sure that it is. He's feeling a little uncertain, and yet he chooses to step out to where he believes Jesus might be anyway. Incredible faith. The second thing is that Jesus is bigger than whatever we're facing. So it's going well. Peter's walking towards Jesus on the water, but then something changes and he begins to sink. The waves start to look really big, and he realizes, "I'm doing something impossible that I shouldn't be able to do. I can't do this." His focus goes from where Jesus is and who Jesus is to the situation that he's in, and he's overwhelmed by it. All of a sudden, the situation takes center stage. He's no longer looking at Jesus. And in fact, the situation from where he's standing looks bigger than Jesus. And if I'm honest, this is often something that happens to me. I allow my emotions and my situations to overwhelm me to the point that I can't see Jesus anymore, because I'm so busy being overwhelmed with and looking at the situation I'm in, the emotions I'm feeling. And I think this is something that Satan encourages in us. If you go right back to the beginning, to the book of Genesis, the first thing that Satan does with Adam and Eve is he encourages them to look away from what God has given them and the blessings they have, to look at what they don't have and their own lack. They focus on themselves. And it's at that point that Satan knows that when we're focused on the situation rather than Jesus, that we will begin to sink. Someone once said to me that a situation only has power over you if you believe the lie that it is bigger than Jesus. A couple of years ago, I was facing that kind of situation where my emotions and the situation were overwhelming me to the point that it would randomly rise up in me and cause me to panic, even when I was walking in the shops. And the only way I found that I could manage it was to, at that point that it rose up, say, Jesus, I choose to let go and look at you instead. I choose to let go of my emotions. And it was in those times that Jesus really gave me his peace. We can choose to take captive every thought, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 10, verse 5. And the final thing today is that Peter has a moment of intimacy in the middle of his storm. Eventually, Peter calls out to Jesus, Lord, save me. And Jesus, of course, he lifts him up onto the waves. And the most beautiful thing happens. Not only does Jesus immediately come to him and lift him up, but they also walk hand in hand together through the storm that Peter was in. In the middle of the storm, Peter finds intimacy with Jesus. And you know, it's often that way, that in the middle of our biggest storms is when we find the most intimacy with Jesus as we call out to him. And we're going to look in the next few videos at how we can practically manage those doubts so we don't get to a place of sinking. But the two things for today is, whatever you're facing, one, take captive those thoughts. Jesus is bigger than the situation you are in. But also, remember that Jesus is with you and he wants you to have intimacy with him as you walk through that storm. Amen.